All right, everybody, we are live again, Dynasty Search for Uhuru. And it's been a while, Professor Larry Davis on with us today. And today's topic is, and Professor Davis is the expert. It's a lot of background noise, Professor Davis.
Actually, I have my. If you need me, I can take you off my earpiece and maybe you can hear me better. Is that fine?
Well, let's see how the people in the chat room how they respond to it. So
Okay, sure. Yeah, because I have my TV off and everything's off, so as a
okay,
matter of fact, it's quiet here.
okay. All right. So today's topic is why Black Americans' contribution to Africa should be recognized. I feel as if, Professor Davis, and correct me if I'm wrong, as if a lot of Africans experience amnesia when it comes to the role we played in the development and just overall freedom. We're dealing with apartheid. You have the Booker T. Washington Act, or Booker T. Washington, and the African. What was the Immigration Act that?
Well, it was okay. Dr. Tyrene Wright, she
Correct.
wrote a book called Booker T. Washington: The Making of a Making of a Pan-Africanist, and she talks about the African exclusionary measures.
Right, there you go.
Right.
And it's a list of the AME Church.
Well, Dinus, and again, there are just so many African American led institutions or founded institutions that have been engaging the African continent for centuries. The AME Church, as you know, has been around for centuries. But not only that institution, you have the Africa America Institute, which was established in 1953 by Dr. Horace Bond, who was the president of Lincoln University, which is an HBCU, and also Dr. William Leo Hasbury, who was the founder of African Studies at Howard University. Those two particular professors got together, and they felt the need to have an institution in place which would assist newly freed African nations in terms of their educational development.
Okay. Now, a lot of people will say that now the majority of African leaders have been educated in the West, correct? Is that true?
A lot of them have been, yes. And let me just kind of qualify that. Many, when you say the West, I would say yes. A majority were educated either in Europe, Western Europe, the United States, Canada, or the former Soviet Union or Soviet bloc. And so most Africans have been educated, especially the first generation of new presidents, prime ministers, were educated in outside of Africa because very, very few African nations had secondary institutions of higher learning. Now, South Africa may have been an exception, but the vast majority of those countries, those colonial countries, had not a lot of universities. And so, in essence, future African leaders had to go outside to receive a quality education. So, yes.
Okay. And then I would say the complaint will be that since these African leaders have been educated in the West, they've been programmed or indoctrinated with Western thinking, which has been counterproductive to African development.
Well,
what would be your response to that?
What I would say, man, what the Japanese did and what the Chinese did, they took what they needed from the West, right? Education, technology, and they took it home, and they basically reinterpreted it for their own people. And I think that unfortunately, that has not happened. I think fast enough in Africa, man. One of the issues that, from my perspective, is that unfortunately, African leadership has not taken the time to invest in the masses of their people. You have a tiny elite who are highly educated, skilled, professional folks who are just incredible people. But what needs to happen is that needs to be trickled down to just the everyday African person. And that's an issue. It's just not happening fast enough. So what I'm saying to you, Didas, is that unfortunately the governments of these 54 African nations, and I don't, and I want to be careful that I don't want to speak or provide or give like a blanket statement, but it just appears to me that not enough is being done to educate the masses of African people to ensure that they have a quality of life at home and they won't have to immigrate to Europe, to Canada, or to the United States, because what's happening is a brain drain. For example, I saw a statistic that said that there are between 45 and 50,000 Nigerian doctors in the United States, but at the same time, they're less than
like 20,000 maybe in all of Nigeria or something like that.
I think between 35 and 40 that are practicing in Nigeria, which makes no sense because Nigeria has roughly 200 million people. And so there are not enough doctors, man, to really take care of their own citizens. And I understand that, that people want to go out and to live a quality of life because their host country does not offer those opportunities. And so therefore, well, if I can make a six-figure income in the U.S., Canada, or the U.K., well, I have to go there. Right. But that's problematic because that's brain drain for your citizens, for your host country.
Okay. Now, the African whose, I guess, argument would be, well, the wages are high enough to justify me staying in Nigeria or in Africa to be a doctor, when, again, I could go to the U.S. or go to Europe and get paid 50 times the amount. Your response is, well, you're still causing brain drain. Like, do you what would be why would an African who's paid to go to school, who is now a doctor, now a lawyer, why would you recommend them staying in Africa?
Well, first of all, Africa has everything: natural resources, a beautiful climate. I mean, it literally has everything, Didas. Mm-hmm. Africans really don't need to leave at all to go to the West. Well, they have everything except good governance. That's it, and that's the main issue. And until, let's just say, the AU or individual countries, man, figure out how they can move forward, man. You're gonna have this ongoing problem of brain drain. And what you're going to end up having is that the Chinese and Indians and others coming in really taking control of the assets, which is extremely problematic, man. I mean,
okay. And then you brought up the Chinese. You have a lot of Africans who are living vicariously through the sweat equity that the Chinese are putting in, as if this is some type of business partnership.
Well, let me share this with you, Dinas, and you and I spoke about this before, man. One of the reasons why China now is booming and India is booming is because the governments of India and China reached out to their diaspora, right? Okay. Now, there are roughly 60 million Chinese in the diaspora all over the globe. Professional folks, business owners, and the government of China says, you know what? Wow, we have a huge skilled population outside of China that can come back and help us build. And that's exactly what they did, man. Those Chinese, some of them went home, and they used the skills that they acquired in the UK or the United States, et cetera, to help revolutionize China. Same thing with the Indian diaspora from India. And here it is, you have 50 million African Americans. Well, let me just put it to you this way. There are over 200 million Africans living in the diaspora in the United States, Brazil, and all over the place that have skills at all levels who could actually help the African continent move forward collectively, man, in terms of improving the infrastructure. But I don't think that the 54 independent nations are doing enough, man, to kind of market themselves and says, hey, listen, Black diaspora, you're in America, you're in the UK, you can help us.
Right.
And because, believe it or not, man, the secret weapons to Africa's success is the Black diaspora.
True.
And I honestly think that Africans on the continent, the leadership on the continent, man, should actually take note to what we have to offer, because I think it's sad when Nigerians, folks from Cameroon or from any African country have to leave their homeland, travel 4, 5, 6,000 miles across an ocean just to live a quality of life in the West.
I said, let's see what we have going on in the chat room. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you hit that like. Make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe as well if you're new to the platform. Now, Professor Davis, me and you, right, are always having these debates and arguments.
Sure.
Not me and you between us, but me and you siding on one side versus the naysayers on the other side who express and want to say that Black Americans have played no role in the development of Africa. How dangerous is that? Like,
it's really Dionysus. Unfortunately, it's just it's an issue of education first of all, and I think that unfortunately, a lot of unless you're from the elite African classes, you're not aware of what's going on. And here's the issue again. The elites of Africa are not really investing in their own citizens. And so therefore, if you're, let's just say, an everyday African person, you're undereducated, you're underskilled, you haven't been exposed to the contributions that Black Americans have made, then unfortunately, you're going to look at the media and you're going to see the negative stereotypes of Blacks, which is extremely problematic. I often tell my African friends here in the United States that Black Americans are anchored in the entire history of the United States, and we've been here for over 500 years, and that you can't talk about American history without mentioning Black Americans. I mean, we literally built the country. We literally built Washington, D.C., the White House, and all the inventions and so on and so forth. I mean, they're just legendary. But unfortunately, this information isn't shared among a lot of Africans who come here. I mean, the face that they see is white. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. You've heard of Dr. Joy McGrew, right? Who she did the thing on.
Is that the she's light skinned, has locks?
Exactly. She talks about post-traumatic slave disorder.
Okay.
A few years ago, she went to Southern Africa, and along with 9 other African Americans, and she stood up, and she was speaking to an African audience, of course, in South Africa, and she stood up and said something. She was very brief. She says, "Hi, I'm Dr. Joy McGrew. I'm from the United States, along with these other African Americans. We're coming here to engage Africans on the continent." And so the translator stood up and he was explaining, and it took him about 10 minutes to explain. And she looked over at him. She says, "Wait a minute, I said something very brief. I stood up for about a minute and explained who I was." And the translator had to explain to the audience that, okay, she's African American. She is a descendant of the slave trade and so on and so forth. And now she's back to kind of re-engage. And basically what the translator was explaining to her is that these people had no concept of the slave trade or what had happened to us. They were just, I mean, there was a disconnect.
Right.
They had no idea at all. And what I'm saying is that even when I was in Ghana back in 2012, some of the Ghanaian educators told me that in the public school systems there, they really don't teach the history of the slave trade and what happened. And so, again, I think there's just this disconnect. And even when Africans come to the United States, a lot of them don't know our contributions or what we have added to the richness of the American experience. And I have to kind of sit back and share with them that we've literally played a role in all aspects of America, all the wars, the inventions, even going back to politics in terms of Reconstruction, or even before that, the first elected Black person, African American, in the United States was elected in 1641. 1641. And so I try to give them some type of context of who we are and our contributions. But again, this is an ongoing process, and there's a lot of work to do. I do want to say this. That's why I think that the opening of the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture is just so relevant. Since it's been open for the last 2 years, more than 5 million people have actually passed through those doors. And so folks are getting a better understanding of who we are and what our contributions have been, not only to the American experience, but to the globe.
But you know what? What I'm starting to notice is, are there a lot of, I would say, and just in general, Black people in general, whether they be from the continent of Africa or Black Americans or the diaspora, are they interested in the Smithsonian Museum?
Oh, absolutely. I live in Maryland, and I have friends and family who come here all the time, and they're like, "Oh my God, I'm having a difficult time you know, getting inside the museum because it's always busy." And so there's a lot of interest, man, not only with Black Americans and from African immigrants or Caribbean immigrants, but from all segments of of America and the world. Because think about it, Dinus. We've been here. We, meaning African Americans, have lived in the U.S. for over 5 centuries, for over 500 years. And unfortunately, for a long time, our story has not been told. And keep this in mind too, that there are literally thousands of historic African American landmarks in all 50 U.S. states and our territories. So, but unfortunately, this history has not been highlighted in a large way until the opening of this museum. And so there's a lot of work to be done there.
Let's see here. Veins of Africa wants to know, veins of African blood. Shout out for the super chat. Ask him if Putin was right about Africa being a graveyard for African elites.
Oh my!
What young Africans could do, and what can young Africans do to change that?
You know, Dinus, you're trying to get me in trouble now. You're
always in trouble. Go ahead.
We were doing well. Look, I'll just say this. Are African leaders doing enough to ensure that they keep their human capital at home? No, they're not doing enough. And it saddens me, Dinus, to see young people, young men and women who are risking their lives, man, and thousands are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen on a continent that has everything. But again, it's just a lack of leadership. And as I said to you earlier, man, if African leaders are making decisions without involving the Black diaspora, and again, what I mean by the Black diaspora is those of us who are, the majority of us who are the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade in the West or in the United States or North and South America, then they're making a huge mistake. And let me just say this to you too. We've discussed, we've talked about Dr. Arikana Chihimbura-Quayle, who is the Africa Union ambassador to the 6th region. And the 6th region, of course, is the Black diaspora. And what she is doing is trying to bridge the gap between continental Africans and Africans in the diaspora. And that's the way forward. Now, here's something interesting about Dr. Arikana Chihimbura-Quayle. She is a recipient of an African American scholarship. Now, what do I mean by that? Dr. Arikana Chihimbura-Quayle received a full ride, an African American scholarship, whereby she graduated. She got her undergraduate degree and a master's degree at Fisk University, which is a historically Black college. And once she graduated, she walked across the street to Meharry, which is a historically Black medical school, and got her medical degree. And so she was able to come to the United States from Zimbabwe, and get an African American scholarship and live the American dream. And one of the ways that she was able to do that, because she was interacting with the African American Institute, which is an institution or an organization that was established by Black Americans to ensure Africans were actually had some opportunity to receive a quality education. And that's just an example, a simple example of how we are working across the ocean and engaging.
What's the advantage of, I would say, Africa reaching out to the Black American or just Black diaspora in general
And
versus
again,
China
this,
and everybody
well, this,
else?
well, it's the skill set. I mean, anything that the Chinese can do, and I don't want to overspeak and over exaggerate. Look, let me just say this: China is a huge, second largest economy in the world, 12, 13 trillion dollars, 1.3 billion people. I mean, it's just a huge market. But having said that, man, you and again, I think that the gift, if you will, is that African Americans, I think, or not only African Americans, but the Black diaspora, I think, would be in a better position to assist the continent. And I don't think they have an ulterior motive. Now, China, on the other hand, look, I'm glad that the Chinese are helping to establish better infrastructure across Africa, and I'm hoping that it's a win-win situation. But Don, it's nothing's for free. Nothing is for free, and I just think that if you compare the two, blacks in the diaspora don't have a hidden agenda. They don't have a hidden agenda of coming to misuse the resources or to marginalize the folks who are there. I think they sincerely would like to reconnect to their place of origin. And unfortunately, I just think that there's a whole lot of work to do in terms of re-engaging. And I think that one way to do that, man, is at the level of our institutions. You have African American led institutions such as I mentioned before, the Africa America Institute, the Constituency for Africa, the Africare, the Whitaker Group. There are just so many others where these specific institutions, man. I mean, they actually span the gamut in terms of how they can help to take the African continent forward. But again, just to go back to my point, I think that that the blacks in the diaspora don't have a negative ulterior motive in terms of trying to undermine the African continent.
All right. What about now we've played a vital role in the development of Africa, and of course we've always engaged Africa. What about those who say why what about those that would suggest that Black Americans just completely leave America and relocate to Black America? I mean, relocate to
Well,
Africa.
okay. We have a permanent stake in the United States. We built the country, literally. It was forced labor for the most part, man. But no, we have a permanent stake not only in the United States, but in Canada as well. And and so why would you leave? Why would you leave a country that you've actually built? It just makes no sense.
Right.
And to allow others from, let's just say, folks coming from Latin America or from Asia or from Europe to kind of come and live this, if you will, the American dream. No, the American dream also belongs to Black America. We are African Americans are a distinct population within the context of the United States. Now, what do I mean by that, Dinas? Well, there is no other group in America that has had to endure some 450 years of terror, 250 years of enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow, decades of bad public policy decisions, which were disruptive to healthy Black family development, and now the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. But with all that I've just said, we're still standing. And and our legacy has actually helped really shape the legacy of so many others. And it would just make no sense to me to just hightail and just leave when when you literally built the country. Our ancestors' blood, sweat, and tears built this country, and not only the United States, but also, as I always explain, man, Canada. I mean, the I'll just say this: Black Canadians, and up until the 1960s, almost all blacks in Canada had come from the United States. And so that means that blacks in Canada, former African Americans, have fought in every Canadian war or conflict. And they were the foundation of Black culture in Canada. And so again, it just makes no sense for us to just leave because of racism and we've been marginalized. So we should always have a base in the country that we built.
All right, what about those that say that we were slave labor, so we really have no equity in this country because we were free labor?
No question about it, man. No question about it, that we're definitely slave labor, but also too, man. Now, a segment of my family has been free since the 1700s, and so there are quite a few African Americans that I know who were able to kind of take their freedom or gain their freedom over time. And so those folks have been playing a role in establishing historically Black universities, building institutions. And so again, these are examples of what? Okay, these folks are providing. Well, I'll just say this: they're doing what Du Bois has said. These are the talented 10 who are working with folks who were still in captivity, right? And so these folks says, you know what? We have a responsibility for those folks who are not yet free. And so I look at it from that perspective, man. No question about it that we were kidnapped. And as I stated to you before, slavery was big business. There were some African elites who basically entered into this partnership with whites for the sale of human captives because at that particular time, certain African kingdoms were at war, and so they were like they basically sold folks to for a profit, and that's just the reality of what happened. I mean, it's a complicated history, but nonetheless, man, as I stated before, we have a permanent stake because of our labor in terms of building the country.
Now, me and you've talked about Liberia extensively. Right. What about the idea of Black Americans having their own nation again?
Wow, that's a good question. That is a very, 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 very good question, man. And you know what, Donis? I honestly, I really can't give you an in-depth answer because I haven't kind of sat down and thought through what that would look like. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I do believe this. If that were the case, let's just say we had carved out an enclave someplace in Africa, right. East Africa, Southern Africa, etc. What I do believe is this, man. If we took our best and brightest, I would say within a generation, you would have something like a Hong Kong in Africa or like a Singapore in Africa.
Because I agree. So why not focus on that?
That's a good question, man. And you know what? I would probably leave that to younger minds like you to kind of work out what that would look like and to mobilize, let's just say, young Black Americans, folks from the West Indies, others from the Black diaspora who would like to do that and come up with some type of idea of how it would be going forward. It's something again that I haven't thought about in depth. I will say this: I think in the 1970s, Liberia was somewhat of an example.
Somewhat, it was an example.
Yeah, no question about it. In the 1970s, it had reached. I think right around 75 or so, 1975, that Liberia had a per capita income that was, I think, equal to that of Japan. For a few years. Which is remarkable, but we know what happened afterward. But again, I haven't thought through what it would look like, and perhaps you and some of your friends can kind of sit down and kind of work out how we should move forward in that regard.
Professor Davis, now you're working on a couple projects. Is your book almost ready?
Yes. It should be in the beginning of the new year, 2019. I'll be in Canada. I've been invited to Montreal in February for Black History Month, and I'll be discussing Black history in Canada, which is pretty fascinating history as well, too, man. So I'm looking forward to that. But I will definitely keep you posted in terms of it. Yes, I'm working on a number of projects as it relates to Black history, African American history, Canadian history, etc.
Let's see what else we have here in the chat room. So what's the plan moving forward? I know you've been doing some work with the as far as engaging Africa, and I know you've been doing some important work, and I know the AU ambassador has been somewhat active in DC as far as engaging Black Americans. Like, what are your thoughts? Where are we going with that?
Right. As you're aware, I had a chance to attend an U.S. Africa foreign policy summit with some major political, not only political leaders, but folks who are Africa specialists. And so let me just say this, Dinus. I'm really optimistic in terms of what I'm beginning to see.
Okay. What do you see? What do you see? What do you see?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of engagement with, especially with brilliant young people in the United States, in the Black diaspora, as well as brilliant Africans on the continent. And these folks know and understand that there's a need for us to work together, and that we have a lot to offer one another. But I just think that what needs to happen is that, African Americans have institutions that are in place, and what I think needs to happen is that, and I keep in mind that most of the African countries are newly independent, 50, 60 years. It takes a long time for nations to coalesce.
So, go ahead. And I have a question for you. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. And so I think that, as these countries mature and you get younger leaders, right? Some who would have been educated in the West, others would have been educated in Africa, man. They're going to be able to turn the page and says, you know what, God, we have a skilled population here on the continent. We have a whole lot of skilled population in the West. And they're going to begin to say to themselves, why do we need to be using all of our human capital in the Western world, which is already developed? Why not take these skills back to Africa and create, a brand new society, something new, something authentically African for the next generation? And that's what I'm beginning to see with young people, man, as they engage.
Now you brought it. Now you keep. It's I would say a constant, consistent theme that these African nations are brand new, newer. They just came out of colonialism. 40 years ago, roughly. 50 years ago, roughly. So they need time to get things together and build. Then you have countries like Singapore, Japan,
right,
Hong Kong. What's been the issue of why, even with all the natural resources that Africa has, why haven't they been able to turn the corner and build like Singapore?
It seems to me, and I could be wrong, man, that there's this, I don't know, I think in some, and I could be wrong, Dinus, but what comes to mind, that there is this sense of the Chinese, the Europeans, their ice is colder. They're they can do it better than we can do it, and that's problematic. And I don't think that enough Africans feel they have the confidence to take the continent forward, and that just needs to happen. I mean, listen, the Africans who come to the United States do exceptionally well. I think perhaps they're from the elite and they do well. But I think it just makes sense to me. To take those same skills and develop Africa. And the reason that I say that, man, you and I have been to South Africa, right?
Correct.
And you know that the white minority, 8% of the population, controls, my God, man,
80% of the wealth.
Exactly, which makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. I want to see Africans say, you know what? We have a ton of folks in the United States who are skilled. We have a ton of folks in the UK or what have you. that we can work together, man, and build a brand new Africa. Because see what I got a question for you, Dennis. I'm sure you've heard the term Africa for the Africans, right?
Correct. But currently right now, Africa for the Africans is being built by China.
Right, right. But do you know who made that comment, or who actually is the originator of that comment?
Probably a Black American or someone of the diaspora.
You're 100% right. Martin Delaney actually made that comment, and of course, it was made popular by Marcus Garvey, and Delaney was from West Virginia. And but the point of the matter is, man, is that he really felt, as I do, is that in order for Africa to be successful and move forward, it has to be Africa for the Africans. And when I say that, I'm not talking about just continental Africans. I'm talking about folks who are in the diaspora. Yes, I'm African American, but I am also African. So, and I just think it's important for us to kind of make that clear.
See what else we have here. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you hit that like button as you come to the chat. Also share as well. We have Professor Davis on with us. It's been a while, Professor Davis. It's been months.
I know. I've been crisscrossing the globe, man, and traveled, and so lots have been going on. And writing, I've just been extremely busy. There's just not enough hours in a day.
How do you think this Chinese African relationship is going to end?
A few years ago, Dennis, I had a chance to interview and talk to Howard French. He's a African American. He's a professor of journalism at Columbia University, and he wrote the book Africa's Second Continent. He was talking about China. He's a China expert, and he was somewhat reluctant in terms of the engagement. He really felt that unfortunately it's an unequal partnership, and that Africans need to critically, they need to be careful in terms of how they engage the Chinese. It should be a win-win situation. And he gave me the impression that that's just not the case. And again, I am in no way against development in terms of infrastructure. Right. But again, it should be in a situation where the African continent is truly benefiting, and they're not the lesser partner. It should be equal partnership. So I'm gonna cautiously wait. But again, man, I think that because of the slave trades, meaning the East African slave trades and the transatlantic, and being Africa being colonized, I think that that the leadership of those 54 countries should say, you know what, it's time for us now to kind of take the bull by the horn and ensure that that when we're engaging with Europe or America or China, that that it's in the best interest of Africa.
So Valerie Pigford is asking, I want to go to Africa, but why can't we buy land? Now, you can buy land in Africa, depends on which country. What will happen to us once our services are no longer needed? So Professor Davis, as you can see, as me and you, we've both experienced, what Black American has contributed to the development of Africa is not recognized. So right. What can you do this next go around to ensure that it's not forgotten, it's done?
Let me just say this, man. And African Americans, again, need to understand, or Blacks in the diaspora need to understand, that we are fundamentally American. We are. Yes, we're African. That's our ancestral homeland, our background. But we have a permanent stake, and always should have a permanent stake in the United States. Now, with that said, do we also have a stake in Africa? Absolutely. I think that every Black person in the diaspora that was stolen and brought to build a new world, right, you still have a permanent stake here. And so therefore, what I would say to the young lady is, listen, visit the 54 countries in Africa. Pick a country, go see what it's all about, and see how you can engage. But I would tell her that it's a long process. It's not, it's something where you can't maybe visit one time, 2 times, 10 times. but there has to be ongoing engagement. And the reason that I say ongoing engagement is because think about this, Dinus. Blacks in the diaspora are unique in the sense that there was a break. There was a 500-year break in history. You had people who were kidnapped and sold and brought to the West. And so the folks who were born and raised in the Western world are fundamentally something else. Now, take for example the Chinese. There's a Chinese diaspora all over the globe as well too. But there was never a break in culture.
Right.
As you and I have spoken on many occasions, one of the things that I do when I travel the globe is I visit Chinatowns all over. And I've been to Chinatowns in Singapore, in Vancouver, Canada, in San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is no break in cultural continuity when it comes to Chinese culture because the Chinese never experienced a slave trade in the same way that we did. And so, in essence, for us to kind of move forward collectively as African people, we must always engage. I think the best way to do it, well, two things. I think it's important for us to do it at the level of our institutions. But I also, I've learned something. I actually like the way that you're doing as well. You're actually going grassroots. You actually meet people on the ground, which is in some ways better because you get a chance to interact with, if you will, the real Africans or the majority of the population. And you're giving us an opportunity to kind of see much of traditional Africa, because at what I'm doing, it's kind of the elite, highly educated, skilled Africans who are attending universities here that I meet in the U.S. or some prestigious universities in Africa, which is fine. But as I stated before, we need to constantly engage, man. Because how we the diaspora got to the West is unique in history.
All right, let's see what else we have here in the chat room. Okay, so Professor Davis, as far as when we always think of engagement with Africa, as far as the diaspora, we primarily think Black America. What about Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos? Like, what role?
Right. It's interesting.
Play a contribution to the development of Africa.
Now, what I'll say is this, and please forgive me for my lack of knowledge in regards to, let's just say, Black institutions in the Caribbean and Black institutions across Latin America. I'll say this, most of the institutions that I'm aware of, if they are Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Latino, these are folks who have immigrated to the United States, right? And so they're engaging from that level. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any mainstream, let's just say, institutions in Latin America that are that are engaging in Africa in that way. Now, from the African American perspective, they're just a plethora, and they're all over the place. And I'll just say this, for example. Dinus, as you well know, the Congressional Black Caucus is roughly, I think it's 55 to 60 members now, right? Which is huge. And they've been extremely important. I'll give you an example. During the Liberian Civil War, when a lot of Liberians were refugees, the Congressional Black Caucus was able to lobby the U.S. government to bring literally thousands of Liberians to the United States so they could find safe harbor. And that's just an example, if you will, of an African American institution that has tremendous power, man, to be transformative on the African continent. Now, perhaps you should reach out to, let's just say, someone who is an Afro-Caribbean, or someone from Latin America, Colombia, Brazil, and say to them, well, do you have any institutions that are in place that are engaging Africa in ways that can be measured? Unfortunately, I don't know of any.
See what else we have here in the chat room. Now, do you feel as if Black Americans should, I guess, spend half their time in Africa and half their time here in America? Like, how does this relationship, as far as connecting, look?
I think that that should be based on interests. And let me just say this too, Donis. Now that we have Dr. Chihambora Quao, who is the African Union ambassador to the United States, that question perhaps could be posed to her. And so what that would look like. I do think if that were to happen, man, I think that those African countries would have to kind of lead the way. It says, hey, we want to engage the Black diaspora. Here's how we can do it. Here's how we can provide, let's just say, a way that you can engage us here on the African continent. And I think that that's an outstanding idea, because the beautiful thing about being from Africa is that you're on your home continent, right? And so your government, your leaders should actually have the power, man, to kind of re-engage, if you will, your children in the West. And I just think that they should be leading the way in that regard.
Oh, cool. Let's see. Shout out to Dundada. Shout out to Holub Sizzle. To have a nation state in mind. Let's see here. Why are Africans in America? Someone asked that question. But I think we've already covered.
Right. Yeah, well, and again, look, man, the United States markets itself as the land of opportunity.
All right.
Come, live your dreams. And it is. Look, America, with all its issues, is a dynamic country, without question, man. I mean, it truly is. Dinas, I mean, there is no other place in the world where you've had millions of people come from nothing. And they basically transform their lives. I mean, this is an amazing country, without question. And so people will risk their lives, man, to if you will, to live the American dream, and the United States will give you that opportunity. It does love an underdog, and so that's why they come. Because look, I mean, it's look, we lead the world in terms of technology, space travel, art, culture, entertainment. I mean, it's just an amazing place to be.
See what else we got here. Okay, here we go. Here's a good question. I know you're more engaged with the Black Canadian diaspora. What are their views on Africa?
Good question, man. I think that I'll just say this. Canada is unique, and the Black population there is diverse. There are three groups. There are, of course, the historic Black population, which were primarily African Americans, and then you have folks from the Caribbean, and recent immigrants from Africa. So it really depends, man. I honestly think it depends. I mean, if you're talking about the folks who are first generation African Canadians, they still have a connection. Let's just say if their folks are from Ghana, Nigeria, so on and so forth. Some of those folks would be, well, living in Canada. In making a comparison, they would probably say that the countries that their parents are coming from are extremely problematic, and that Canada offers a better quality of life. And I would say that's pretty much the same thing. Let's just say if you're from the Caribbean. Now, if you're a Black Canadian of African American ancestry, man, I just think that your perspective would perhaps be very, very similar to that of Black Americans, meaning that, hey, you've been there for centuries in Canada, but you've been marginalized by a white supremacy system, which is just try to kind of keep you, in a particular place. But again, it's more diverse. As I said before, when you think about the Black population across Canada, it's more mosaic or more of a mixture than it is for, let's just say, Blacks in America, because the 50 plus million Blacks in America are primarily African Americans, West Indians, and African immigrants are a minority part of the Black population. So,
shout out to Africa for Africans Unite. Keep up the great work. Discussions, Dinus. Shout out to Charles Irby. I love the multifaceted issues you cover. Yeah, we try to keep it diverse over here on Search for. Try to keep it diverse.
right.
Try to keep it diverse. Let's see here.
Mm-hmm.
How can we help from a sustainability perspective?
Well, now, define sustainability in terms of what specifically.
JP, if you could define that for us, please come back to us. Okay, here we go. Here's a very controversial topic. Here we go. Here we go.
I'm sure.
We got a couple more questions, then we'll go ahead and close out.
Oh, sure.
Right, so, as me and you both know, Africans, certain tribes, don't want to implicate all of Africa. We're going to say certain tribes conspired with Europeans to sell us into slavery.
Oh, sure.
Do you think Africa owes us anything for that? Even after that, we've been still consistent in engaging Africa. We're pretty much being reciprocated.
Let me just say this, man. Oftentimes when we talk about reparations, what does that look like in terms of how it could happen? We in America, or in the West Indies, this idea of the U.S. and Great Britain, what have you, paying for centuries of enslavement. So, if European nations have to pay reparations, I mean, then what role would Africans? What would Africans have to do? Because when you look at the slave trade, there were buyers and then there were sellers, right? I mean, it was just a business. Slavery was a big business. Now, I don't know what that would look like at all, and I just don't. That's a complicated topic, man. But I do say this. I don't think that. I honestly don't think that African Americans, man, are as a whole are bitter by what happened. I mean, it's just a fact of history. And I think we understand that we're African, no question about it. Because if we were not, we wouldn't call ourselves African Americans. We understand that that's our ancestral home. But we are primarily and fundamentally Americans in 2018 going into 2019. And we should continue to kind of engage the continent moving forward. That's just how I see it.
And then last question, shout out to Holopsism for the super chat. If African Americans and African diasporans were ripped from their motherland and the continental African says we are family, why is a diaspora nation state on the continent divisive, but Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal not? That's the last question. Right.
And interesting. That's a very, 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 very good topic, man. And like I said to you before, man, if that were to happen, I honestly don't know what it would look like, Dinus. I just don't. What I foresee, like I said, there are over 50 million blacks in the United States. And I think that those African Americans who are interested in returning to the African continent, they will critically look at each country, and make a decision where they want to go. It could be Namibia, Botswana, Tanzania, and basically make, and just decide, this is where I want to settle, and actually go from there.
Well, brother, Professor Davis, thank you so much for joining us. What we'll do, we'll go ahead and close out. Any final statements, and also how can everybody get in contact with you?
The gift that the Black diaspora has given to the African continent is the concept of a collective African identity. Please understand, Dinus, the concept of being African, believe it or not, is not from Africa. It's actually from the Black diaspora. Right. Okay, and that's the interesting thing about it, man. So in essence, man, and I hope that your listening audience understand what I'm about to say. The first truly African people to have a collective identity really is the Black diaspora. And what I mean by that specifically is African Americans and West Indians. Pan-Africanism emerges in the United States and in the West Indies. I mentioned to you earlier, Martin Delaney, he's from West Virginia. He coined the term Africa for the African. Alexander Cromwell, who was the mentor of Du Bois, this guy goes on and to Oxford and graduates in 1853 and goes to Liberia and he's there for 20 years. William Blyden is from the West Indies, man. I mean, he's a professor in Liberia for many, many years. And so again, what the Black diaspora has given the African continent is a collective identity. That has been one of our gifts to Africa, is the concept of being African.
Professor Davis.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
You. How can people reach you if they want to contact you?
Right. If people want to continue this dialogue, you can reach me at Davis. I'll spell that DAVIS, L as in Larry, N as in Nathaniel, 20750 at yahoo.com, and we can continue the conversation about the Black diaspora and continental Africans.
Absolutely. Professor Davis, thank you so much for coming on. Everyone,
well, thank you.
Oh, no problem. And don't wait so long to come on. You come back sooner.
Well, honestly, Dinas, I've been traveling, and I have to. I've been invited to Seattle, Washington, and as I stated before, I've been invited to Montreal, Canada, to do a discussion for Black History Month, and also I've been invited to Prince Edward Island, Canada, to talk about Black culture there. I don't know if you're aware, man. There is a diasporic African American community in Prince Edward Island that's been there for 200-300 years.
Wow. Perfect. Everyone, please make sure first of all, thank you for joining us. Make sure you go to search for Huru on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Also like, share, subscribe. Until next time, family, Dinas Demir, search for Huru. Peace.
Thank you. Dinas, thank you so much.
No problem. Take care.